about. There's in my experience in spiritual circles, which I've been a part of for years and years, there's kind of I think a belief, I guess I would call it, that after an awakening, that the ego is gone. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit, because that is not my experience. And other people I know, anyway, you speak for yourself, but it's become clear to me, reading from other people, that that's their experience also. Ego doesn't disappear, although some aspects of it sort of can fall away. But the relation, this is my experience, is the relationship to the ego changes. And so what I discovered was, basically I am not the ego, fundamentally. And that's never changed. I used to feel like I am the ego. And therefore, in just a metaphor, that the ego is sort of driving the car. And now I feel like the ego is in the back seat. It's sitting in the back seat, still there, and I can still get triggered like anybody else. Certain things can still trigger me, meaning trigger a disproportionate emotional response. I can get angry, irritable, upset about some event. But the relationship to that whole mechanism of ego has changed, where it can be arising, like let's say I get upset about something, the whole mechanism can arise, but part of me is not identified with it. So it's like something sort of moving through my system. And I've noticed the more I become aware of these points that do trigger me, certain events or certain situations in life that can trigger some sort of egoic response, the more I become familiar with them and allow them, and I'm aware of them happening as they're happening, not as they're happening. The less grip, they seem to get smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's kind of a slow, very slow process. It's not like something disappears. I went through after the awakening, I know I've talked about this with you, but after the awakening, I went through about 6 months of intense feelings of hatred came up. And it was hatred about just everything. I was just full of hate. I hated basically that life was not occurring the way I wanted it to. I was not getting what I wanted when I wanted, like a little 2-year-old having a temper tantrum. And but it was real. I can only, I'm just speculating here what was going on there, but I must have repressed all that stuff, I think, as a 2-year-old. I have no idea, but it was just coming up. It was coming up, and all I could do was go, whoa, here comes another wave of hatred, and I would just let it be. I didn't resist it. I didn't express it. I didn't go around, or I tried not to. I did my best not to spew my hatred onto people, but and slowly, it would work through my system. Like one round of it would sort of go through me, and in its wake, it would leave me feeling more conscious. It was a kind of an amazing experience. If I really didn't interfere with it, just let it have its time to be felt. I had to feel it, just allow the feeling. In the wake of it, I felt more more awake. Anyway, but that's just it. I just wanted to sort of touch on that point that I think can be a misconception of people think after an awakening there's no ego, and that's certainly not my experience. But I'd be interested to hear anything. Well, your take on it.
Some of the things that come up in me while I'm listening to you talk is that before having the experience of, I call it isness, before having this experience of realizing that you are everything or nothing, in a way, what the experience really is that you're not separate. You're not a separate thing.
Yeah.
Before that, I had heard about the ego, obviously. I've heard about it for years, the ego. But the truth of the matter is I never really understood what the ego was until that experience happened. And the truth of the matter is I really didn't. I was the ego. It identified with it so completely that there was really nothing else. When I had this experience of the witness being witnessed, the one witnessing and the one being witnessed, and that there was no differentiation at all. When I had that experience, then I realized there's a thing called the ego, because now there was something else there. There was something else that I was, that I am. And so consequently, that's what became enlightening in a way. That was part of that enlightening experience. So it's to realize that, I'm not anything of what I think I was. And then, of course, the next thing is to start to see that it all has to do with identification, is that if you're so identified with something, then of course, how can you think otherwise, that you're just identified with it?
Yep.
So once I had that experience, now I'm stepped out of that identification. And as you said, slowly, you step further and further away from that particular identification as you experience that sense of unity, that sense of non-separation, that sense of isness or oneness, or so many ways of saying it, that slowly you're transferring over your identification in a certain way. So now, in a certain kind of way, what happened was I started to identify more and more with the sense of isness in me, rather than that sense of oneness in me, rather than the sense of what I call ego, what you call ego, which is a little self. And then as time went on, what started to happen is to realize that I'm becoming identified with something else.
Right.
And so as time went on, I began to see that, identification itself is somewhat of the issue here. So exactly. I'm not this isness either. I'm not this ego either. I am something amazingly beyond both, which I cannot even begin to try to describe or tell you. But you see it. It's just a process that you just will see. It's just... So the first stage is first to see that you're not this separate entity that you've been thinking you are forever and a day, and that's the first step. And then as time goes on, you're not even the non-separate entity that it's except that you are both in a way. So that's where. That's the process as I see it, as I experience it. That was the process, and that is the process. And you were mentioning that there were levels of enlightenment. In Buddhist terms, there are levels of enlightenment. I can see that, but I can only tell you the experience that I'm having right now and what I have had. I cannot make comment about the third or fourth or fifth or sixth level. I don't know if what that is or what that matters. But I do know that as far as I'm concerned, the most important experience is to begin to realize that you are not simply this separate entity and everything else outside is not you, and you are there alone against the universe in essence. And when that happens, I think tremendous things change. But the process doesn't end. It's not like, oh, you've reached a full point. You've reached a point, and the process goes on. That's how I have experienced it, and I think it relates to what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I agree, actually. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So the course of the ego is, I think we talked about this before, it's like the ego, in many of the mystics have always said this, is the ego is a tool. And, the Western mystics especially used to say that the ego has to be in service of that sense of unity self.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
As opposed to being just a service to itself.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
So in essence, they've been saying that for centuries, is that these two things are there, and they're truly not two things. They're really one thing, but they appear to be two.
Yeah.
So you're not going to lose that, especially when you're in this physicality. It's just part of that existence here at this way. Now, in non-physicality, I'm not going to say anything. But in physicality, there is definitely this thing that you need to have this separate sense of self. Otherwise, you're going to be in deep trouble acting in the world.
Yeah. And isn't it fascinating, this the difference between what you just pointed out, the difference between when you're find yourself acting from ego as opposed to acting from awareness, but ego could be there. It's like night and day. One is acting from awareness. Ego can arise, like you could get firm with somebody, for example, to set a boundary, which is kind of an egoic expression, but it's just has a completely different feeling. It still feels in harmony with everything.
Yeah.
Whereas when ego does something, it feels that it's opposed. It's really in opposition to a lot of stuff. Very different feeling.
The best way I can try to explain that from my point of view is that when you're acting out of a spontaneous, intuitive space, you're acting from that space of unity. It's almost like you can feel the whole of you is going there, wherever you're going, and it's going there. As opposed to when you act out of a sense of should, or guilt, or want, or desire, or whatever else is however else you want to put
idealism.
Then it's exactly. Yeah. Then you kind of you're caught up in that ego, and it's not to say that we don't get caught up. I get caught up in doing that in that way, but the fact that I've had this experience, and I'm sure that's true for you as well, is that now I have something to reflect it against, to see and say, well, wait a minute, what is going on here?
Right.
And to fall back into that space of unity and spontaneity.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the reasons why the Zenists do all these koans and things like that is to get you into that space of spontaneity, that space of the sense of knowing, the whole being knowing, and just going with it.
Right.
They do that a lot, and same thing with Osho, and actually the same thing with most mystics who are have had these experiences.
Yes.
That's it. That's
as opposed to this isolated thought mechanism knowing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
oh, that's logical, but not.
Right.
But if it may be logical, but it may not really be your whole being
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
So that's I think part of it.